Welcome to this Factory Design Suite Tech Tip, provided by Imaginet Technologies. My name is Rusty Belcher. In today's Tech Tip, we're going to focus on asset development and specifically how much model detail you use when you're modeling an asset. Well, simply put, you want to keep your asset as simple as possible. The asset should represent the fit, form, and function of the component you're working on, but you should use as minimal detail as possible. You also want to represent the asset using a single inventor part file instead of a large assembly. Often, you have to convert a large assembly into a single part file, and there's a number of tools built into Inventor that allow you to do that, specifically the Shrinkwrap command and the Inventor simplification tools. I think most engineers are familiar with the KISS principle, keeping it simple whenever possible. And when it comes to asset development, this principle is extremely important. Very often, equipment manufacturers realize that their production level models are far too complex to use as assets in the Factory Design Suite. When they were generating the production level models, they included every fastener, every detail on the motor mounts, and the pulleys that make up their conveyors. And all of that detail is far too much to add to an asset model inside of Factory Design Suite. I've opened up one of my favorite examples of excessive model detail to share with you. Here's an electrical panel that I use quite often in some of my demonstrations. And as I zoom in, I have to admire the effort that the original author of this model put into this design. He modeled every single switch, every single button, every single fastener. If I come down to the bottom of the design, he even modeled the chain on the little protective caps for the plugs at the bottom of the machine. And while this is a fantastic model, it is a good example of excessive detail. You have to remember that when you use this in an assembly layout of a factory, it's basically going to be shown from the top view. And even then, it's going to be shown from a very high level as far as elevation goes. So basically, you could represent this piece of equipment with a single rectangle on a 2D drawing. Now, a simplified version of this asset I also have available. Let's go ahead and look at that. And you can see that I modeled just a simple box that represents the cabinet. I did take into account the handles that are on the front of the piece of equipment and the electrical connections that are on the side. Those are critical details that need to be included in the asset, but everything else needs to be represented in as simple a form as possible. Asset components must be modeled as accurately as possible. They must also be modeled to the simplest representation possible. So how can you determine which features to include in your asset and which to exclude? Well, the principle of fit, form, and function is a great place to start. The principle states, if the specifications and criteria of an item's fit, form, and function are met, all other features are considered extraneous. When it comes to fit, form, and function, I do have a list of best practices that I try to follow. I try to eliminate fillets, chamfers, and tapers whenever possible. I also try to eliminate holes unless they represent a specific connection point that's necessary for the asset. I try to eliminate shells or remove any interior features. The contact faces that are shared between assets are critically important, and they need to be modeled dimensionally accurate, but they also need to be modeled to the simplest form possible. My clearance zones and my maintenance spaces can be modeled as separate solid bodies, and I can use a transparent color to represent those spaces. Typically, you want to avoid assemblies and use a single part whenever possible. It's important that you remove all adaptive features from your components before you publish them to be a factory asset. And finally, all unnecessary fasteners should be removed prior to publishing. Here's a pump that I downloaded from GrabCAD, and it's a fantastic model of a pump, but there's a lot of model detail that I don't need for a factory asset. Here's my simplified version. You can see that I kept the contact surfaces and they are dimensionally accurate. But I removed all the detail from the pump and I simplified the frame. Again, the fit of the pump is correct, its form is generally correct, and its function will work downstream in the Factory Design Suite. Remember the electrical box that I showed you earlier? Remember how we talked about removing all of the extraneous model detail and leaving just a simple representation? Well, the features that we chose to include are important. We have the clearances for the handles up front that we maintained, and we also maintained our connection points for the electrical connections. It's important to remember that the factory layout process often requires the placement of hundreds or thousands of assets. That's why it's necessary to publish assets with the simplest model detail possible. But it's also important that we create our layouts using the fewest files possible. This is why we should always try to represent our assets using a single file instead of an assembly. Inventor has a fantastic workflow that allows us to simulate an assembly using a single part file. The workflow is called multi-body modeling. I've opened up a multi-body part, and you can tell it's a multi-body part if you go to the part icon here. Also, the solid bodies folder, if I expand that, you'll see the 3 bodies that make up our component. This is a CNC machine, and I've modeled the body of the machine and the tray of the machine, as well as a clearance zone with separate solid bodies. Let me show you how to make a solid body. I'm simply going to use the conventional modeling practices that are part of Inventor. We'll go ahead and sketch on the door here, and I'll start the revolve command. Just like normal, I'll come in and select my profiles. We use the axis of the door as our revolution, and I'll pull around to 130 degrees. Now, in the revolution dialog box or the quick access toolbar, I'm going to select New Solid Body. This will create an independent body that's part of the part file. I'll click OK, and now you see we have an additional solid body. Now there's many benefits to solid bodies. The first and the major one is that we can simulate assemblies inside of a single part file. There's also some added benefits. We can apply color to the individual bodies separate from each other. This means that I can have transparent bodies right alongside of opaque bodies. And to do that, we simply select the body in question. We come up to our appearance colors and select the appropriate color. Here's another example I use when I talk about the importance of multi-body modeling versus assemblies. The model on the left is a shock-mounted server cabinet, and it contains over 700 components. There are 10 components in the latch on the door alone. Now this is a fantastic model, but it's way too heavy to be used as a factory asset. When I generated the asset for this, I simply started from scratch and modeled a primitive version of the cabinet. I removed all internal detail, and I kept everything as simple as possible. It's important to remember that I might need 20 or 30 of these shock-mounted server cabinets in my final factory layout. And if I can use a single part instead of a 700-part assembly, I'm saving myself a lot of computer resources. Inventor offers several tools that allow you to convert an assembly to a single component. Some of these tools include the derived component command, the multi-body import option, Inventor simplification, and Shrinkwrap. In today's example, we're really going to focus on the Shrinkwrap command. The Shrinkwrap command is a very easy and effective way to convert an Inventor assembly into a single Inventor part file. In this Shrinkwrap example, I'm going to convert this tank assembly into a single multi-body part file. To do that, I'm going to use the Shrinkwrap command. For this example, I'm going to use the default name and click OK. Let me go ahead and spin the tank around so we can see what's going on here. Now there are a lot of options with the Shrinkwrap utility. I'm going to use the multi-body option. This will generate a multi-body component. I'm going to remove any parts that I can't see. I'm also going to choose to patch all the holes. Anytime I can remove the internal features, I save myself a lot of graphics capability. I'll click the preview button and let you see how all the holes are going to be patched. You also have the option to break the link with the parent file so that you can create an independent component, which is what I want to do here. I'll click OK, and it generates a single part file that represents the tank assembly. If I go to the View tab, I can generate my half section view and let you see that all internal features have been removed from this design. In this Shrinkwrap example, I'm working on a pump assembly that was imported from another CAD system. Now, we've already mentioned before the importance of converting our assemblies into a single part file. This assembly has a number of parts, and when I use it in my layout, I'm just going to insert it as a single component. So to convert it to a single multi-body part, again, I'm going to use the Shrinkwrap command. Again, using the default name and choosing the multi-body option, it's very easy for me to turn an assembly into a single multi-body part file. It is common for designers who are adopting Factory Design Suite to create their first assets from production detailed models they've created in the past. While there are tools that allow you to remove or eliminate detail from an existing model, you must consider the time and effort required to complete this task and compare it to the time required to create a simple version of the asset from scratch. It is often quicker and easier to create a new version of the asset from scratch. This will conclude our tech tip on keeping it simple with model detail for factory asset development. The next time you generate a factory asset, I hope you keep in mind the things we talked about in this tech tip. If you have questions about the contents of this video, please contact your Imaginet Technologies account manager or support representative.